Good afternoon. My name is Patrick Griffin. I'm the chair of the History Department at Notre Dame, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this panel on justice and the American project. I'm going to introduce our speakers one at a time. They're each going to speak for 10 to 15 minutes, after which we'll open it up to a robust discussion. Our first speaker today is H.T. Engelhardt. He's a professor of philosophy at Rice University. He received an MD from Tulane and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Texas at Austin, where he also served as a professor. Engelhardt specializes in the history and philosophy of medicine and continental philosophy. His research is primarily in the area of bioethics. His major contribution to the study of ethics is his book, The Foundation of Christian Bioethics. He is presently professor of philosophy at Rice University and professor of medicine at Baylor College of Medicine, both in Houston, Texas. Please join me in welcoming Professor Engelhardt.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. There are certain venues at which I preach. This is not one of them. Also, I'm not here to praise justice or the American project, but to voice some puzzles about justice and the so-called American project. These puzzles come from me as a philosopher reflecting on the nature of secular notions of justice, as well as puzzles that I have as a Texan who has been compelled to participate in the American project, whatever that may be. In any event, as a Christian, I take great consolation from the fact that our God is not a just God, but a God who shows mercy. However, these last issues are for a different time and place. Here, the focus is pagan. The advertisement for the conference quotes Cicero's De Officiis, that in justice we see, quote, the crowning glory of the virtues, justitia in qua virtutis splendor maximus. To appreciate the quote, it is necessary to understand what Cicero meant by justice, and that is no easy task. This attempt brings us to confront the ambiguity in the concepts of justice themselves, and impart the ambiguity that must be recognized before addressing the ambiguities of the American project. For example, Cicero states, the foundation of justice, moreover, is good faith. That is truth and fidelity to promises and agreements. Fundamentum autem est justitia fides, id est dictorum coventorum quae constantia et virtus. But Cicero also notes the first office of justice is to keep one man from doing harm to another, and then qualification a Texan would love, unless provoked by wrong. And the next is to lead men to use common possessions for the common interest and private property for their own goals. Sed justitia primum Munoz est, ut nequi quis nociat nisi lacassitus ignoria, diendea communibus pro communibus utata privatus ut suis. Given this understanding, a government would be just, and a national project would be just, that preserves the guarantees of its constitution, that support the rule of law, and that defend life and property. Cicero's commitment to justice as keeping faith is made clear when he gives as an exemplar of a just man the Roman Regulus, who in the First Punic War was taken prisoner by the Carthaginians, but then was sent back to Rome on parole to arrange for an exchange of prisoners. Once in Rome, Regulus made a motion in the Senate that the prisoners should not be returned. Then, because of his previous promise to return, albeit made under duress, he went back to the Carthaginians and to certain death by torture. For Cicero, Regulus was the example of a just man, in that he was faithful to a promise, even one made under duress. This very strict sense of keeping faith may or may not be the cardinal sense of justice that most of us at this point have in mind. The general point I wish to make is that the term justice is, at best, ambiguous. The meaning and content of justice depend on a particular normative vision, and there are many, a particular thin theory of the good, and there are many, and a particular moral and political vision, of which a multiplicity abounds. There is, one should remember, again, a multiplicity of concrete views of justice, ranging from the various views of social justice to the various views of justice as the protection of life and property. The Justinian Code, which is the basis for all of European law, begins with defining justice. Justice is the constant and perpetual wish to render to each one his due. Justitia est constans et perpetua voluntas. Jus sui cuique tribuent. The question is then, what is due to each other? Depending on how one answers, one will have embraced a different view of justice and a different view of what the project of a nation should be. To consider how different views of justice for a nation can be, one might compare the justice celebrated by social democrats, such as John Rawls, and what would be endorsed as justice by a thoughtful, sensitive Singaporean. Rawls, in his ethical ordering of goods, places liberty first, fair equality of opportunity second, and prosperity and social advantage third, this last to be pursued only insofar as one's excess possessions of these goods redounds to the benefit of the least forlorn class. The vision of justice brings one to affirm social democratic constitutions. In contrast, a morally sensitive Singaporean Confucian knows that one should rank security first, prosperity of the family second, and then liberty third, and then only insofar as civil liberties are compatible with the security and prosperity of families. Fair equality of opportunity should, with animus, be dismissed as adverse to the flourishing of the family, a point that Rawls makes 3 times in his theory of justice. This account of justice leads one to affirm the superior justice of a one-party capitalist state. This understanding of justice, one should know, helps to avoid the fiscal bankruptcy to which social democratic states appear disposed, given their welfare commitments. Such Singaporean approaches also appear to be less corrosive of families, and without a robust safety net, there will be costs from leaving the family or reproducing outside the family. The Singaporean approach also helps to keep faith with its citizens. It has a financially supportable approach to healthcare financing and retirement income, an important part of justice for Cicero. To accomplish this, Singapore compels savings, 36% of what you earn, to ensure high-quality health care and the support for retirement so as to be just to future generations. Rawlsian and Singaporean visions of justice are at odds with each other. These diverse visions of justice divide. Similar puzzles arise regarding the American project. especially when one speaks of the American project in the singular. Is there one American project? From the beginning, there appear to have been profound divisions in America as to what the American project is or should be. There was a gulf, for example, between the Puritan and Cavalier cultures and their visions of the American project, which Anne Norton explored in her book, Alternative Americas. I quote, "Ancestors of the Cavaliers had come to the promised land with the notion of improving their circumstances rather than themselves. Unlike the Puritan refugees, they retained an affection for their native land, which they bequeathed to their descendants. They aspired to, rather than disdain, the amorous abandon of the English court. The Virginia aristocracy, formed as the Blands, Bowlings, Randolphs, and Boldens were, from the intermarriage of English and Indian, it presented to the Puritan New England mind the possibility of the establishment in America of a new Canaan rather than a new Israel. America will not, according to the Cavaliers, be the city on the hill, but the Merry Mount, offering a pagan union. The propagation of the Cavalier type awakened at once fears of an aristocratic feudal order and self-indulgent sexuality. The Puritans were the proto-neocons who wished to shine the light of their justice on the world by bringing to others their vision of liberty, equality, and justice. The Cavaliers were satisfied if they could maintain a government that avoided tyranny while preserving life and property. A deep division regarding the American project can also be seen at the founding and afterwards, in terms of the different views regarding Francophile and Anglophile approaches to government. The former celebrated the French Enlightenment and eventually elements of the French Revolution. They were therefore closer in their commitment to Europeans than to many Americans. They had sympathy for what would become a movement through statecraft to advance human dignity and mutual respect. It is for this reason that Europeans generally celebrate the American Declaration of Independence and see it as affirming the political goals and a moral vision similar to what they embrace. They endorse the Declaration of Independence announcement, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Europeans are so deeply affirm these words that they often presume that they are part of the Constitution of the United States. They also often conclude that the American Constitution must reflect commitments to these goods as basic constitutional rights. It comes to them as a great shock that the Constitution of the United States, the most long-lasting constitution of a major polity, excluding Massachusetts, which has an older constitution but could compete on size, it makes no reference to men being equal, to human dignity, or to there being any inalienable rights. The Constitution of the United States is written within what is the Constitution is not written within what would become the human rights tradition. Rather, it is written within the tradition of defending the rights of Englishmen. After mentioning justice in the preamble, but not anywhere else, the only reference to equality involves procedural equality and occurs in the 14th Amendment, where states are prohibited from denying, quote, "any citizen within the state's jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws," whatever the laws are. The U.S. Constitution is the only written, formal, right constitution of a major polity. none of the substantive commitments to human rights that are implicit in the Declaration of Independence are reflected in the Constitution, which was completed on the 17th of September, 1787. That Constitution, one might note, was set in force in 1789, contrary to Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation, and therefore, by Cicero's light, unjustly. So I'm beginning to try to sketch those views of a nation's project which are reflected in the material right constitutions of all European countries, and ours, our exceptionalism, nothing's there about human rights. The human rights interpretation of the American project has been focused on realizing the commitments of the Declaration of Independence. This understanding of the American project that is framed within the tradition of the rights of Englishmen recognizes justice as requiring that there be adequate protection of individuals and families in their lives, properties, and beliefs from interference by the government. Unlike the human rights interpretation of the American project, which focuses on the pursuit of claim rights against the government on behalf of human equality, human dignity, and social justice, the rights of Englishmen understanding of the American project focuses on limiting government in order to allow the governed to achieve their own views of their own goods. This American project set itself against arbitrary power and the tyranny of the majority through establishing a limited constitutional government. Within the rights of Englishmen approach to the American project, the pursuit of happiness, human flourishing, is accomplished only indirectly. It is achieved by the pursuit of limited government through the magisterial eschewal of both common law and the American Constitution from directly speaking to issues of social justice, human rights, and human dignity. As a distant example of the pursuit of human flourishing, through eschewing interference as far as possible in the financial lives of individuals and families, one might think of the fact that after World War II, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines had roughly equivalent gross domestic products. The Philippines preached social justice, and the other parties embraced the importance of the protection of life and property. The latter flourished. At the core of the rights of Englishmen approach to the American project is an understanding by limiting arbitrary power and pursuing space for individuals, families, and intermediate institutions, humans can flourish. One must note in this regard that one of the few points on which Federalists and Anti-Federalists agreed was their recognition of the danger of democracy. Consequently, America remains the least democratic of major democratic Western nations, in that 1/6 of the population elects 50% of the senators, who constitute the more authoritative of the two houses of Congress. This American project sought to prevent the tyranny of the majority, to contain the aspirations constitutionally to establish one material view of justice, and instead to make possible the flourishing of individuals and families pursuing diverse views of human flourishing. This understanding of the American project has recently been provocatively summarized by Charles Murray, who engages the term the American project in order to refer, and I quote, a national life based on the founder's idea that the sum of good government, and we might say just government, as Thomas Jefferson put it in his first inaugural address, is a state that shall, quote, shall restrain men from injuring each other, sounds like a direct quote from Cicero, and then leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, also not far from Cicero's sentiments. The American project, committed to the rights of Englishmen and limited government, is in its foundation opposed to the view that focuses on human rights. The conflict is substantive. One need only consider the recent election and the often striding moral and political divisions in America in order to appreciate how substantially disparate these two understandings of the American project and the pursuit of justice are. Americans are not united around one understanding of the American project, nor around one view of the pursuit of justice. These disagreements have become fundamental to the contentious and divided character of American public life. They are integral to the notion of the culture wars, which James Davison Hunter introduced in 1991, when he identified the cluster of major cultural conflicts that, among other things, involves a struggle between the advocates of competing views of the American project, and to which which should become normative in public policy and law. At stake is the definition of the American public forum and the public square. The conflict is about which sense of justice should shape the taken for granted character of American life. In closing, let me suggest a way of putting these two competing visions of justice and the American project into a broader account of America's constitutional success. The American commitment to a formal right constitution has provided at the core of the American project an understanding of government that allowed Americans from time to dally with some of the ideas that moved Europe in what would become human rights tradition. The Constitution, however, ensured that these pursuits would not easily become part of the American project over time in the sense of being constitutionally established. The American commitment to a formal right constitution allows for pursuing within this framework multiple material understandings of justice. It recognizes the radical secular moral pluralism that characterizes the fallen human condition. And if one is committed to establish a constitutional framework that could, through stability, protect life and property over time, then one would eschew placing specific material visions of justice into the Constitution. In this light, one can understand the enduring American project as establishing procedural safeguards for the rights of Englishmen that will give protection even when some Americans may seek to pursue some of the visions for community that grew out of the French Enlightenment. This is the American project that has endured. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Vincent Phillip Munoz. He is the Tocqueville Associate Professor of Religion and Public Life in the Department of Political Science and concurrent Associate Professor of Law at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Munoz writes and teaches across the fields of political philosophy, constitutional studies, and American politics. He holds a BA and MA from Claremont McKenna. His recent research is focused on the theme of religious liberty in the American Constitution. He is the author, most notably, of God and the Founders, Madison, Washington, and Jefferson. Dr. Munoz is in the process of completing 2 more books related to religious freedom. He is the director of Notre Dame's Tocqueville Program for Inquiry into Religion and American Public Life. Please join me in welcoming Phillip Munoz.
Good afternoon. Thank you to Carter Sneed for organizing this fine conference. It's my pleasure to be a participant in it. Always a pleasure to see Professor Engelhardt, and pleasure to be on the panel with my good friend Patrick Deneen. Professor Engelhardt, I think, just gave the best defense of Singapore ever produced by a Texan. Professor Deneen, as I'm sure you all know, was hired by Notre Dame earlier this calendar year. I'm proud to say that I was the chair of the search committee that lured him away from Georgetown. During our internal deliberations about Patrick, there's a little bit of pushback. Colleagues of mine in the political science department suggested that perhaps we were too similar in our views, and having a little bit more diversity would be more beneficial to the department. I assured my colleagues that Patrick and I definitively disagreed about matters of fundamental importance. My colleagues didn't believe me, actually. Maybe they will believe me after today's panel. The title of my talk is Why Faithful Catholics Should Be Patriotic Americans. I was thinking of changing it to Why Faithful Catholics Should Be Patriotic Singaporeans. I'm going to address that topic by way of a critique of Patrick's recent First Things article. The article is titled Unsustainable Liberalism. I'm sure some of you, maybe most of you, have read the article. If you haven't read it, you should. It's a boldly provocative piece that reflects deep thinking about our current political and cultural situation. But because some of you probably have not read the piece, I'm going to begin with a short summary of it. I'll offer a few thoughts about what I think Patrick gets right, but also a few thoughts about what he might get wrong. And you'll see my argument is not that Professor Deneen is incorrect about what ails liberalism today. In fact, I think his diagnosis is spot on. But that he might overlook or understate the resources available to us through a return to America's founding principles. But just to show my justice and equality, I'll begin actually with a brief critique of Professor Engelhardt. I'm confused by your opposition of the Founders' Constitution and the human rights tradition, because in Federalist 84, of course, Hamilton says the Constitution is a Bill of Rights. So but that's not what he says. I think it's.
If you look at the debate that takes place, starting about 1688 to the French Revolution, the goal was to contrast the rights of Englishmen with human rights, explicitly so after Robespierre.
That might have been the debate in 1688, but I think the debate in 1787 was actually about how to protect natural rights, not the rights of Englishmen, and that the Constitution, at least in Hamilton's view, others might have disagreed, was that the Constitution, in fact, helped secure those rights, and that's why it was worthy of reflection and choice. But maybe we'll save that for our later discussion. I have a critique of Patrick to deliver. Liberalism, Professor Deneen states, is unsustainable. It's unsustainable because its success, that is liberalism's success, depends on non-liberal institutions. Yet the very practice of liberalism undermines these very institutions. Liberalism thus contradicts itself, thus inevitably, he suggests, it will collapse. Professor Deneen identifies two key commitments of the liberal project. First, anthropological individualism, and secondly, opposition to nature. By anthropological individualism, I think Patrick means that liberalism above all values individual choice. Liberalism values the right over the good. It prioritizes the individual's right to form his own conception of the good over any definitive normative conception of the good. Say the same thing differently, liberalism, as he nicely states it in his article, liberalism dismisses the idea that there are wrong or bad choices. Because there's no good, no real good, individuals ought to be left to form their own conceptions of the good, and that is anthropological individualism. This commitment to anthropological individualism, he says, is fatal to those social structures and institutions that restrain self-centeredness and really human flourishing. Liberalism destabilizes the family because it teaches husbands and wives that the legitimacy of their marriage, of all human relationships, depends on choice. So if you no longer choose your wife or children, you can dispense with them. Liberalism displaces churches and civic organizations because the modern bureaucratic state provides for citizens what they cannot provide for themselves. I think Professor Engelhardt would agree with this. Head Start when you're a child, college loans when you're a young adult, unemployment compensation when you lose your job, Social Security and Medicare when you are a senior. Our social instincts that lead us to others are blunted by the large bureaucratic state that cares for us throughout our lives, especially if we're named Julia. This frees us from having to care for or needing the care of others. Liberalism, Professor Deneen says, encourages loose connections. Perhaps worst of all, liberalism dehumanizes the individual because it teaches him to value above all else the exercise of his will. And it's not just autonomy. Our capitalistic system directs us to exercise our wills primarily in the pursuit of material and physical gratification. Liberalism teaches us to be self-centered, utility-maximizing, pleasure-seeking animals. If this seems bad, I'm only halfway through Professor Deneen's critique. The other reason liberalism is unsustainable, he says, is because it's hostile to nature. I think what he means is a normative conception of nature. Liberalism rejects the idea that we have a fixed human nature. It also rejects the idea that we should be guided or limited by nature. Patrick does not dwell long here, but I think we can see where his argument is going. We overcome the natural connection between sex and pregnancy with a pill and abortion. We overcome the sadness that accompanies life's difficulties with psychotropic drugs. We may soon overcome the death itself, or aging, by age-enhancing developments of the modern scientific project that aim not to harness nature, but really to overcome it. The end result of liberalism's commitment to autonomy on the one hand and emancipation from nature on the other is the adolescent who spends 4 years of college hooking up, then gets married but encourages his wife to have an abortion because he has no time for a child. Eventually he divorces his wife in exchange for a series of trophy girlfriends, all the while making a lot of money, probably as a plastic surgeon, which he spends in his later years by purchasing all sorts of unnecessary gadgets and, of course, an unlimited supply of Viagra. That's what our culture teaches, and our culture teaches us this in the fundamental political and philosophical principles on which our nation is based. And now, admittedly, I exaggerate a little. With Obamacare now in place, our fictional husband will no longer actually have to purchase Viagra. Patrick's critique is devastating of much of our contemporary cultural practices, and I'm largely sympathetic with it. I'm not going to defend the life I just described. I wonder, though, if he has accurately identified the root cause of that which he rightfully laments. Patrick criticizes liberalism generally. He speaks of the liberal project, and he recommends that we begin to theorize what a post-liberal polity might look like. If I understand him correctly, he's not calling for a return to a liberalism properly understood, properly restrained, but rather he intends for us to imagine a new vision of politics and community constructed perhaps on a new political philosophy. I say I'm not sure of this because at some point in the article he points to medieval conceptions, which I think he might favor, but we can talk about that more in the Q&A. Professor Deneen's call, I think, is for an intellectual revolution on how we conceive society and its proper ordering. And here, I think, is where Patrick and I depart. I'm not against revolution per se. I just think we should return to the principles of our first one. Patrick sees the pathologies of modern life to be caused by liberalism, but I wonder if instead what has happened is that we have departed from a healthy and proper understanding of liberalism and succumbed to temptations that liberalism makes possible. These temptations, I suggest, are not themselves a necessary product of liberalism, or are not necessarily grounded in the essence of liberalism. Moreover, let me also suggest that the path to a more healthy and sustainable society is not innovation or imagination or the development of a new political philosophy, but rather a return to our founding principles, principles grounded upon truth about truth and a deep respect for nature. In the article, Patrick identifies Thomas Hobbes by name, and I think John Rawls is present throughout it. And these are the founders, or the founder and the contemporary exponent of liberalism. But it's not obvious to me that if we want to understand American liberal democracy, that this is where we should start. America's liberal tradition begins with the Declaration of Independence. And when we turn to the Declaration, we don't find a defense of the primacy of choice or opposition to nature, the twin pathologies identified in the article. The philosophy of the Declaration begins with an assertion of truth. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Moreover, the truth held is a truth about nature, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. When asked to explain the meaning of equality in the Declaration, Jefferson said the following. This is in a letter written at the end of his life. "The mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their back, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God." Notice that Jefferson turns to nature and the natural order of God, created by God, to identify and defend and explain America's most fundamental political principle of equality. The truth of human equality is not true because we have chosen it or asserted it. Rather, it's true because we recognize, accept, and in fact, we build our political institutions upon truths we discover in nature. It is truth that guides and limits our choices. At least that's the argument of the Declaration of Independence. Perhaps we should say, more accurately reflecting American history, it is a truth that should limit our choices, as we have not always lived up to our principles. The greatest crimes against humanity committed by America, of course, are slavery and abortion. Slavery was defended in the 19th century primarily as a matter of choice. Not the choice of the individual, but the choice of local communities to decide for themselves what domestic institutions they would have. Stephen Douglas put it this way in an 1858 speech. This is a speech he gave in Chicago, but he said this all throughout the Lincoln-Douglas debates. I think this is from an 1854 speech. This is what he says. "It is no answer to this argument to say that slavery is an evil, and hence should not be tolerated. You must allow the people to decide for themselves whether they desire a Maine liquor law or not. You allow them to decide for themselves what kind of common schools they will have, what systems of banking they will adopt, or whether they will adopt any at all. You allow them to decide for themselves the relations between husband and wife, parent and child, guardian and ward. In fact, you allow them to decide for themselves all other questions. And why not upon this question? When you put a limitation on the right of the people to decide what laws they want, you have destroyed the fundamental principle of self-government." That again is from Stephen Douglas. So long before Rawls, Douglas and other defenders of slavery advanced the idea that the right is prior to the good. And we hear this argument today. Just take Douglas's quotation and substitute the word abortion for slavery and replace individual for people, and you have Joe Biden's defense of his pro-choice position. So why do I bring up Stephen Douglas and Joe Biden? It's because they both advanced an impoverished understanding of the principles of American democracy. They failed to understand and to recognize that America, properly understood, is committed to the truth of human equality, a truth established by nature and nature's God, a truth that properly limits our choices and directs them. And what's frustrating about Professor Deneen's essay is that I think he accepts Douglas's and Biden's understanding as the authentic representations of the American liberal tradition. That, I believe, is an error. It's a particularly unfortunate error because it leads us astray from finding within our tradition the principles that would help us return to a proper understanding of liberalism. So rather than create something new, I would direct us to the more modest task of recovering something we have unfortunately lost, something old. America's true liberal heritage is not to be found in Hobbes or Rawls, but rather in the natural rights philosophy of our founding fathers, in the natural rights statesmanship of Abraham Lincoln. In that natural rights tradition, we can find a commitment to truth and a profound respect for nature and the natural order created by God, and I think in it a profound respect for justice. But it's perhaps during the question and discussion that will follow, we can also see how a return to the founding, I believe, offers our best hope for a more sustainable liberalism. Thank you very much.
yourself open with a fictional husband, but I'm not going to go there. Our final speaker is Patrick Deneen. He's Associate Professor of Political Science and the Frank Potenziani Chair of Constitutional Studies here at Notre Dame. His fields of specialty include constitutional law and politics and political theory. He holds a BA in English literature and a PhD in political science from Rutgers. From 1997 to 2005, he was Assistant Professor of Government at Princeton. From there, he moved on to Georgetown before joining the faculty here at Notre Dame in the fall of 2012. And welcome. His interests include ancient and modern political thought, American political thought, American constitutionalism, literature and politics, religion and politics. He has published several books and articles, including his most recent book, Redeeming Democracy in America. Please join me in welcoming Patrick Deneen.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you to Carter and the center. After a number of years of trying to get invited to be a speaker at the conference, I realized only Notre Dame faculty get those invitations, and Tristram. So I decided that I had to join the faculty in order to get invited, but I suspect this will be my last invitation after what I have to say today. It's also clear to me that these long, cold, dark winters are going to be longer and colder in the company of Phillip Munoz. I feel like I'm living my own personal no exit. No, in fact, it was in part to be a colleague of Philip's that I was eager to join the faculty here, knowing that what I expect to be a long, I hope a long and fruitful career of conversations together would elicit, I think, deeper and more thorough reflections on our own views, and I'm looking forward to those, including listening to what he had to say about my article in First Things. I wasn't prepared to respond directly to those, but I think that the remarks that I prepared in some ways respond indirectly, in part by raising questions about the very nature of the founding. And so by way of a kind of indirect response, I will go ahead and read my prepared remarks. Like Tristram, I was taken by the description of this conference, which reads, and I'll read the full description, quote, in his famous work, De Officiis, Marcus Tullius Cicero wrote that in justice we see the crowning glory of the virtues. Countless treatises, encyclicals, verses, and artistic endeavors by a vast array of philosophers, theologians, poets, and painters have explored the manifold aspects of justice, particularly its meaning and its manifestation in our souls and societies, end quote. And so I would like to pose the question whether the American Constitution and its main work of justification, the Federalist Papers, can be said to be included in those countless works, those treatises, those works of those encyclicals, verses, etc., that explore the nature of justice. Is the constitutional order of the United States one that is, as it claims, intended to establish justice? What evidence do we find for this famous claim that is made in the preamble of the Constitution? Justice, the crowning glory of the virtues, is in fact not much in evidence in the words of either the Constitution itself or the Federalist Papers. The word appears 3 times in the text of the Constitution, including that invocation in the preamble that the Constitution establishes justice, as well as 2 other, perhaps less exalted moments, one referring to the Chief Justice in Article 1, Section 3, and the other referring to fugitives who flee from justice in Article 4. It is the meaning of this latter usage of the word justice, in fact, that dominates the extent to which the word is used in the text of the 85 Papers of the Federalist. That is, its dominant use is as a term referring to the processes and activities of the legal sphere, such as the recurring phrase civil justice. In total, and I have spent a lot of nights doing this, in total the word justice appears in the Federalist Papers 64 times in the course of 85 papers amounting to roughly 400 pages. Mostly, again, in this use referring to the system or application of legal norms and administration. For comparison's sake, again, justice appears 64 times. The word commerce appears 76 times. the word liberty 146 times, and the word power 631 times. Neither the Constitution nor the Federalist Papers say much explicitly about justice, notwithstanding the bold claim in the preamble added at the last point of the Constitutional Convention that it seeks to establish justice. Of course, we know that the Federalist Papers are not a formal work of philosophy. It is a collection, and indeed a remarkable collection, of editorials that sought to persuade the electorate of New York to ratify the proposed Constitution. So one perhaps is right not to expect a lengthy disquisition on the nature of justice as such. But this relative absence of the explicit language of justice does not, of course, mean that the Federalist is devoid of reflections, whether explicit or perhaps even more likely implicit, on the nature or relevance of justice. The Federalist Papers and the Constitution it justifies follows the lead, I want to suggest, of the thinkers of the early modern tradition, those who dismissed the ancient efforts to define justice and further to build a city, if only a city in speech, if not in reality, based upon its philosophical dimensions, but rather sought to found a regime that dispensed with the highest aspiration of virtue for a realistic, practical set of institutional arrangements that took human beings as they are. For the ancients, justice was the highest aspiration of the political order, inspiring that oldest work of political philosophy, the Republic of Plato, in its examination of the relationship and the continuity of the just city and the just soul. Justice, it was argued in the Republic, consisted not only of the proper arrangement or institutions of government, but the governance of the city and of the soul in accordance with virtue, and above all, in conformity with a conception of the good. That is why for Plato, or Socrates, I should say, the truly just city would be governed by the philosopher king, that specially trained and educated human being whose unique ability to perceive the good would make possible the rule of the city upon that basis. And why, in turn, the just soul consisted of the proper arrangement of the rational and the spirited parts of the soul governing our appetites. Only the properly governed city and the properly governed soul, Socrates argued, could be understood to be in conformity and indeed to achieve justice. The fact that it was difficult, if not impossible, to achieve this condition did not dim the fact that only such a condition and arrangement constituted the conditions of justice. It was the very unrealizability or difficulty that pertained to the realizability of this ancient aspiration of justice, that aspiration echoed by such thinkers as Cicero and Aquinas, that caused the realist statesman Machiavelli to reject ancient philosophy as so much wishful thinking. As he wrote quite famously in chapter 15 of The Prince, "My hope is to write a book that will be useful, at least to those who read it intelligently. And so I thought it sensible to go straight to a discussion of how things are in real life, and not waste time with a discussion of an imaginary world. For many authors have constructed imaginary republics and principalities that have never existed in practice and never could. For the gap between how people actually behave and how they ought to behave is so great that anyone who ignores everyday reality in order to live up to the ideal will soon discover that he has been taught how to destroy himself and not how to preserve himself." End quote. It was decisively Machiavelli's counsel, and not that of Plato or of Cicero, that the framers adopted as they refounded the United States. Even the rejection of impractical ancient theories based upon appeals to virtue is echoed, and in certain ways even more dismissively, by Publius in Federalist 6. I quote, "Is it not time to awake from the deceitful dream of a golden age and to adopt as a practical maxim for the direction of our political conduct that we, as well as other inhabitants of the globe, are yet remote from the happy empire of perfect wisdom and perfect virtue?" The framers throughout the work of the Federalist view as naive and self-deceptive the appeals to virtue that were launched in antiquity, instead relying on the inescapable fact of human self-interest, the lust for power, why the word power is used 10 times more often than justice. Instead, Publius aims to create a system that will harness self-interest toward the practical ends of relative civic peace and inestimable national power. In this regard as well, their guide is Machiavelli, not the unrealistic, if admirable, aspirations for justice depicted by the ancient philosophers. Quentin Skinner, that great scholar of Machiavelli, has written that of the four classical cardinal virtues, courage, temperance, prudence, and justice, Machiavelli stressed three. Machiavellian virtue, he wrote, requires, quote, a willingness to discount the demands of justice. Something resembling the outward appearance of justice, he intends, will be the result of a set of political arrangements that accept people as they are and seeks to harness their self-interest for the ends of the greatness of the state. That is, he expects a semblance or the appearance of the domestic order to be the result of properly channeled activities of disordered souls. As Machiavellian scholar Anthony Parel has written, Machiavelli is concerned, quote, with external acts, not with internal virtue or the disposition of the soul. This outward semblance of domestic political order, based upon the channeling of internal domestic dissent toward acquisition and national greatness, replaces the ancient aspiration for justice, and in fact becomes the way in which justice is redefined, becomes, in some senses, something quite different from its ancient understanding. In his famous description of fortuna, Machiavelli describes that the human capacity to control at least half of fortune by means of a metaphor to feats of human engineering. He writes, I compare fortune to one of those torrential rivers that when they get angry, break their banks, knock down trees and buildings, strip the soil from one place and deposit it somewhere else. Everyone flees before them. Everyone gives way to their onrush. Nobody can resist them at any point. But although they are powerful, this does not mean that men, when the waters recede, cannot make repairs and build banks and barriers, so that if the waters rise again, either they will be safely kept within their sluices, or at least their onrush will not be as unregulated and destructive. That is, taking the world as it is, Machiavelli recognizes one cannot control the causes, in this case the fact of torrential waters, but that you can manage the effects, not only to make them less destructive, but even by creating canals and by channeling the waters to benefit humanity through predicting or creating forms of predicting their flows. And thus this is precisely the argument offered by Publius in an equally famous passage in Federalist 10, in which he writes that the causes of faction, self-interest, are sown in the nature of man and thus cannot be eliminated. To attempt to eliminate them would require giving them, human beings, the same opinions, the same passions, the same interests, that is to say, the very abolition of liberty. Rejecting the notion that the causes of faction can be combated, instead he calls for the controlling of its effects, particularly by mechanisms, political and geographical, that will make expressions of self-interest not only less destructive to the political fabric, but contribute to the social and economic dynamism of the new nation. Moral and religious motives cannot be relied upon, wrote Publius in that same paper, instead commending a system in which ambition would be made to counteract ambition. Nevertheless, justice is said at points to be the aim of the new constitutional system, if not the internal justice of souls self-governed by virtue, then a form of justice that aspires, in that Machiavellian sense, to a stable and predictable political order. In Federalist 51, Publius writes that justice is the end of government. This claim needs to be measured by the understanding of justice that is maintained throughout the text of the Federalist. In paper 10, Publius writes that the first object of government is not justice, but rather the protection of the diversity of the faculties of men from which the rights of property originate. This first object of government, that is to say, the protection or even encouragement of our diverse faculties, that is, our unequal abilities to industriousness and capacity to achieve various ambitions and life plans, that the protection of these faculties and its material fruits is the first object of government. When speaking of justice throughout the course of the Federalist Papers, it is most often in relation to the protection of these unequal attainments of property by which the attainment of justice is measured. And I could offer many examples, but I'm afraid I'm probably running out of time. Justice so defined, however, becomes a means rather than itself the final end of politics. It is a means to increasing not only simply material inequality, which for ancient republics was believed to lead to stasis and civil strife, but if properly arranged, was the means to achieving national greatness. The lust for power, viewed to be dangerous by ancient philosophy, could be channeled not only into material pursuits, but a project of national greatness. The word power occurs as often as it does in the Federalist, not merely as a caution against that human lust for power, but as an encouragement to those necessary arrangements that would achieve the condition of great national power. Domestically, the political dangers of power could be circumvented by pitting power against power, by supplying the opposite and rival interest to the subordinate distributions of power, as Publius writes in Federalist 51. But by negating power's damaging political effects in the domestic sphere, it would unleash its dynamism and energy in the economic and international, and particularly military realms. As Publius explains and defends the Constitution's bestowal upon the executive of a flexible set of powers, it is particularly in the realm of human affairs, he writes, that there ought to be the capacity to provide for future contingencies as they may happen. And as these are illimitable in their nature, so it is impossibly safely to limit that capacity. Where can we stop short of an indefinite power of providing for emergencies where they arise? Federalist 34. Here, echoing very much the arguments of Machiavelli, the prince must have the capacity to act with limitless power on behalf of the state. The state's unleashed ambitions will lead to great national wealth and greatness, making it more likely that other nations will seek to appropriate or invade, and thus, by a kind of iron syllogism, the ambition for national greatness and wealth make the accumulation of unlimited power by the state necessary and inescapable. For Machiavelli, then, taking the political world as it is, there are only two choices: weakness or strength, effeminacy or greatness. In the discourses he writes, it is impossible to find a balance between weakness and strength, impossible to find a middle way successfully. In drawing up the constitution of a republic, one should aim high and construct it in such a fashion that if circumstance force it to expand, it will be able to hold on to what it has acquired. In fine, both Machiavelli and the founders both accept the modern teaching, well, Machiavelli actually created the modern teaching, that circumstances will require expansion, and that ancient commendations to justice and the ancient virtues more broadly are finally an obstacle to achieving the necessary accumulations of national wealth and power. The modern republic must be built to become an empire. The framers were inheritors, at least sufficiently inheritors, of a classical tradition that recognized the requirements of virtue in the sustenance of political and civil society. However, they made these assumptions of the persistence of virtue in the broader context of an endorsement of a political and economic system premised upon the operated efficacy of actuated vice, particularly the vice of self-interest and self-aggrandizement. If they did not see the ultimate untenability of this arrangement, as a society we have wagered that virtue can be dispensed with. Our wager is that any unsalutary consequence of organized vice can be outstripped by the benefits of organized vice, especially economic growth and military power. And on this point, there is no disagreement or difference between the left and the right today. That today our national future is threatened by the apparent outstripping of vices generated by our pursuit of economic growth and our overextension of military power. Both of these raise doubt about the likely success of this wager. In the embrace of the diversity of faculties, our personal liberties, and of power, and the demotion of justice as a simulacrum of external order, we are undergoing today then a test arising from the very experiment that gave rise to our way of life, whether a regime built upon the engine of our vices is likely to last forever, or even beyond a quarter of a millennium.
We have a little bit of time, but before we open it for questions, I would like to have the panelists respond, if they could, for just briefly to each other. Since Phillip so kindly opened it up to each of them, I think it's only right that they each get an opportunity to say a few words about what the other has said.
My response about the rights of Englishmen. When talking about the rights of Englishmen, I wanted to embed those claims in a particular epistemological tradition. There was never the thought that you could find things to be self-evident, but from the history of common law, you could discern laws of nature somewhat like a physicist would discern. And so that approach is quite different from what occurs in the French Enlightenment, where people can have self-evident intuitions. So that's the contrast I wanted to draw, and it becomes very powerful once the French Revolution threatens England, and they say, look, we have a history where we've tested what we know about how humans work, laws of nature, and we don't know if we can export them elsewhere. Probably that's why they're rights of Englishmen. You must, like Oakeshott, already have certain habits of the heart for them to flourish. So these people are not neo-Cains.
Question, yes.
I have a question for Professor Munoz. And I think I just want to push you a little bit. You seem to be you seem to have a lot of hope in going back to this sort of natural rights truth of the early American founding. And you gave the example of Douglas and Biden. And it struck me that you said, both of them have an impoverished understanding of America, but America fought a war over that understanding. And so I think I just really wanted to push you a little bit more to flesh out this sort of great truths of this going back that we should try and recover. Honestly, Professor Deneen gave a much more skeptical view. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts.
The question, as I understood it, and correct me if I'm wrong, was further explanation about, these are my words, about the virtues of the American founding, especially in light of the necessity of the Civil War. Is that fair enough? No, it's a good question. I mean, if one wanted to critique the founders, it wouldn't be, I wouldn't focus on the Machiavellianism that Professor Deneen focused on. They almost failed, or in some sense they did fail, right? The whole project didn't even last 100 years. There was a civil war. But then we have to ask, well, how did we win the war? Well, part of it actually was military power. So one shouldn't depreciate national strength too much, right? If the North wasn't stronger than the South, right, we wouldn't have the 13th and 14th Amendments, right? So I would, partially in response to Patrick, but also, one should look at Abraham Lincoln, right? I mean, Lincoln's statesmanship, in part, was his political leadership, but in part his recalling and reminding Americans of the primacy of the Declaration of Independence and equality, right? So yes, the American experiment failed on the one hand because it required a civil war, but that war was won to vindicate the principles of the founding, which is how we overcame slavery. So in some ways, the Civil War, I mean, Lincoln talks about a new birth of freedom, right? But that new birth isn't different from the founding. It's a return to the principles of the founding as they should have been followed, if we could have followed them at the time of the founding.
I guess I want to try to pick a fight between Patrick and Tris. You don't have to try. Because you're both saying that there was no robust understanding of justice at the heart of the American founding. However, what Tris is saying, Patrick seems to be lamenting it and saying perhaps there should have been some more ancient understanding of justice that might have, classical understanding of justice that might have been at the heart of the founding. And Tris is saying, no, let many forms of justice or many forms of flourishing come into being by virtue of having limited government. So I'd like to hear you two go at it a bit instead of, I'll take a heat off Phillip.
Well, I suppose it strikes me that an argument that justice will appear, the argument that justice will be diversely defined and diversely embraced is, in some ways you could say, as a reflection on the framers' embrace of the idea that the first object of government is protection of diverse faculties of man. In some ways it's a recognition in the first instance that there is no realistic capacity to achieve a single definition of something like justice. So I don't gainsay that this is in fact would be one of the likely outcomes. It seems to me that though this would be something worthy of lamentation to the extent that these various definitions of justice, I'm not sure if this is your meaning, but I could see this more broadly on the political stage today, lead to essentially self-defined definitions of what constitutes justice. So my definition of justice will be in thoroughgoing conflict with yours, and there's no way simply to appeal to some other standard by which we adjudicate those claims of justice. Simply becomes a matter of preference. When, as Alistair McIntyre, when the conception of the good is replaced with preference, then that is simply the definition of a regime of relativism. For which I would simply say that justice has to be the normative standard that prevents that rather than enables that.
No, you're right. I'm sure no such secular standard exists. And the result is, if you're fashioning a large polity, you move like the later Rawls, who almost becomes a royalty wannabe, moving from moral rationality to the politically reasonable. Then you try to have a modus vivendi that will likely protect life and property. Thank God I'm not an American. My Constitution, to make sure that no one thought it was grounded in a philosophically defensible view of justice or anointed by God, says the first right of all humans is to overthrow government, which to mine is just a modus vivendi. So if we don't make it too costly for some people to go to the streets, we will not preserve life and property. Now, my argument about secular morality, I think you can show in principle. There's no way to pick out one normative principle of justice. And so we look as expediently as we can to maintain a modus vivendi.
Patrick, can I weigh in here? So, was that the Texas Constitution or the Singapore Constitution? It was the Texas Constitution. I don't think a commitment to liberty necessarily entails half-down relativism. I mean, there's something sort of obvious we're overlooking here, which is Christianity. Right? And the idea which, at least the Catholic Church affirmed 50 years ago, the right of religious liberty. So when we talk about protecting the diverse faculties of men, right, which I agree in Patrick's description is perfectly right. In Philip's 10, that's the first object of government. But then you have to, well, why is that good? And it seems impoverished, especially from a classical view. Right? At most, you're aiming at freedom. Shouldn't we aim at virtue? Right? Why just freedom? Because people can misuse their freedom. Well, one of the reasons is because of Christianity. Right? Christianity requires freedom. Right? I mean, what we've left out of this conversation is the Founders' Commitment, the natural right, not the right of England, the natural right to religious freedom. Right? So part of Madison's project, in the Constitution's project, is to leave men free. Why leave them free? So they can pursue religious truth. Well, why not teach them religious truth? Why not order them religious truth?
Well, because the nature of Christianity is you must love God freely. And that requires a limited state. The state can't aim at religious truth, properly understood. I mean, I'm not saying that America is a Christian country, but America is where, in its commitment to religious freedom, is where Christianity can flourish. The end is not simply liberty, it's to use your liberty well. But the state can't make you use your liberty well, right? You have to do that. That means you have to get married and not divorced, right? I mean, maybe the state could do more to help you get divorced. All the state does is leave you free. But that's not necessarily relativistic, because the underlying commitment to freedom is embedded in an understanding of man as a man capable and called, in fact, has an obligation to love God. And so I think it's a too impoverished understanding of America. Right? Freedom is not our end, but from a political view, it's what politics can do to help us achieve our natural and also our God-given ends.
Maybe I will give a sign. Obviously, I think there's good ground for secular, moral, and epistemological skepticism. Clement of Alexandria in 230 said philosophers can't resolve any of these disputes. They're always taught from different premises and different rules of evidence. Now, he wasn't a moral relative absolutist. He was a Christian. He just didn't think philosophers could resolve the argument. And like Agrippa at the time, he thought he had good arguments to show why he couldn't. The second thing, now starts the sermon, Christianity in the first millennium knew that the truth is not a proposition, it's a person. So when you know the truth to set you free, you become united to Christ and do what? Overcome death, resurrection. So the whole idea of freedom and what it was to be a free person in the first 1,000 years of Christianity had nothing to do about good philosophical arguments. It was to know that the truth is not a proposition, it is a person. But philosophers will not be able to tell us the truth, because the truth is never a proposition.
We have time for one more question.
Well, I think one of the questions that I had was starting to be answered. The two questions I had were to Dr. Deneen. The first was, what about the role of the church? It seems that what Machiavelli and Publius said are very much like what Pope Benedict has said, which is that it's to build a utopia, a perfect utopia is not a good idea. And that what you need to do is leave room for the church to give its contribution. So that was my first question, which started to be answered. My second one was about this assumption that self-interest is vice. How is self-interest necessarily vice? I mean, it's the second half of the golden rule that you love others as you love yourself. It seems that self-interest is kind of a standard in Christianity and how you treat others. How does it necessarily relate to vice? And I think the two questions are related because doesn't the church mediate between those, the extremes of those?
Were people able to hear those questions in the back? I agree. I don't want to disagree with Pope Benedict. I would simply say the following. I'm not suggesting, my argument is not on behalf of creating of a utopia. And in fact, in certain respects, you could say that the founders represent a kind of point of departure from the recognition by ancient philosophy of the difficulty and indeed perhaps the impossibility of establishing a political regime based upon virtue. That perhaps we, as Socrates says at the end of book 9, that perhaps the city we have to build is the city in our own souls. The just city has to be built and arranged in our own souls. But that said, I guess I would want to push back that there's a difference between, in some ways, recognizing the inescapable viciousness of human beings, and in some senses, basing a political system upon it, and indeed expecting the flourishing of a political system based upon its predictable operations. Christianity, of course, recognizes the inescapability, as you rightly point out, of self-interest. But it seeks in its teachings to move us from that self-aggrandizement toward other regarding love. What is the result then of growing up and indeed being a part of a political system that shapes us to believe that self-interest is a positive good? That it is in some ways the necessary way in which our political and economic system operate. That it is the very basis by which our society runs. I think that's a very different shaping force in our lives. You could say it's a contradictory shaping force in our lives. And I think for that reason, the church and the church's teachings are in deep competition with the state today in ways that they were not in the conception of the state, for example, as conceived by Augustine, who recognized the limits of the state, but nevertheless that those limits, right, took place within the recognition of the deeper truths of the church and its shaping influence. So I think what you have now is a fundamentally contradictory teaching that is now maintained not only in our sort of deepest political shaping, but of course is manifested in our economic, our commercial, our lives as consumers. And so to that extent, I would say that it's not simply a kind of benign recognition, but actually a deeply and profoundly way of shaping the human soul that lies in contradiction to that which you I think rightly would propose as an alternative. Yeah.
The phrase, "and the whole was full of vice, but the sum was a paradise." Everyone at the time recognized that came from the Brown de Mandible's Fable of the Bees, which was a scandalous book. And it meant real vice. So I think you identify a real tension between how traditional Christians or Orthodox Jews live in the world and this framing structure that the American project has sustained. But if you think there's some way to say something nice about it, go back and read Brown de Mandible's